Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about this beast right here, the Canon R5. Now, I've had the pleasure of owning this camera since it very first came out. So I've had it for a few months now, and I've spent enough time and I've shot enough things with it that I've really kind of dialed in all the settings that I use whenever I'm filming. So that's exactly what I wanted today's video to be about. I want to walk you guys through all the settings I use whenever I'm shooting video with this camera right here. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so I'm going to try to make this as quick and simple as possible for you guys. So first thing, you want to make sure you are in the video mode. So hit the mode up top here on your camera. You hit info between photo and video. I hope you know that by now, but if not, no worries. And then you can just go to the full manual here if you want to. I'm going to go on my custom one, which I'll explain to you guys here more in a little bit why and how you can set that to your own once you kind of dial in your settings if you want, but I'm going to select that. Now I do want to say for this video, I'm doing all the settings through this Q button because it's a little bit visually easier to follow along, but you can also get to any of these settings in the menu system itself. But in my opinion, that gets a little bit more confusing, but there are going to be a couple things I touch on in the menu system at the end of the video that you can't access through the Q button, but we'll get to that here in a bit. Now, next thing we're going to do is hit the Q button right here. So we're going to hit the Q, and then we are going to start in the upper left. So I'm going to scroll to the upper left, and obviously this is touchscreen, but it's just hard for you guys to see what I'm doing if I use the touchscreen. So I'm just going to use the joystick up here. So let's start out with the autofocus method. Now there's really only two that I use in here. It's going to be the face tracking or the expanded autofocus area. The face tracking is whenever I'm shooting anything with a face. So if I am vlogging, filming myself or filming another person, I will have on the face tracking, and whenever I am doing this, I will make sure I hit the info button to enable the eye tracking as well, just because you always want the person's eye to be in focus. You don't want their nose or something else to be in focus. And then the second one that I will do, if maybe I'm shooting B-roll of a product or a location, or basically a product, a subject that isn't a person, I will just be using this. I like that because if I'm shooting B-roll, it's a very specific area that I want to be in focus. And then you can always hit the set button to put it back in the middle if you want. Just a little tip there. Sometimes, rarely, if I have like an overhead rig and I can't see a very specific detail, or I can't tell what's exactly in the middle, I'll maybe do the zone. But the problem with the zone is sometimes something's in focus in that square there that maybe you don't want to be, if there's multiple things that it could be focused on. So just keep that in mind depending on what you're filming, but you might want to mess around with those a little bit yourself and see what works best for your situation. But yeah, basically I will have the autofocus method on the expanded autofocus area if I'm shooting B-roll or anything not a person or a face. And then if I'm ever vlogging or filming another person, I will have the face tracking mode on. So moving on down the line to the next one here, the movie recording size. Now this is definitely probably the most in-depth part of the settings for this camera, because this camera can shoot in so many different recording sizes. It's kind of crazy. You can shoot everything from 1080p to 4K all the way up to 8K, which is still kind of mind-blowing. Now for me, I'm always going to be shooting in 4K with this camera. I don't really think there's going to be situations for me that I would shoot in 1080 or 8K. I got this camera to have a full 4K workflow, so that's what I'm going to be shooting in pretty much all the time. Now there are two different 4Ks. Basically they're just slightly different dimensions, but I'm always on the 4KU because that's your standard 16:9. That's the 3840 by 2160. So I'm always going to be on that one right there. Now, as far as frame rate goes, I'm always working it in a 24 frames per second timeline. So if I'm shooting anything real time, aka if I'm not shooting anything in slow motion, I'm going to be shooting at 23.98. That's just what I prefer. And then whenever I am shooting in slow motion with this camera, I will either be shooting it in 59.94, aka 60 frames per second, or if you want to shoot, you can actually shoot 120 frames per second with this camera. But to access the high frame rate mode, to shoot in 120 frames per second, you actually do have to physically go into the menu, and then you're going to go over here to the movie recording quality. You can access that same menu right there if you want there, but to enable the 120 frames per second, you have to go to the high frame rate mode, and then you enable that, and that's going to turn on the 120 frames per second. So it is a little bit annoying to get into that on the Canon cameras, I'm not going to lie, but I'll show you guys how to set those custom function buttons at the end of this video, because the way I have my camera laid out is I have custom 1 1 that's 24 frames per second. I have custom 2, which is 60 frames per second. And then I have custom 3, which is my 120 frames per second. So that way I can just switch between them very quickly. I don't really have to go through all of the settings in the menus to change it every time I want to. Now, one more thing I want to touch on in here while we're in the menu settings is the 4K HQ mode. This basically downsamples that 8K to 4K. So it's going to give you a very, very good looking 4K, which a lot of people have talked about before. And that's kind of where you run into some of the overheating problems on the Canon R5. Now, although they've come out with a firmware update that has drastically made the overheating better and you don't really run into it too much anymore, you will still run into it if you're shooting HQ mode for very long times. And honestly, I don't really shoot in HQ mode. I don't really mess around with it too much just because I don't ever want my camera to overheat. And personally, to my eye, I can't tell a difference between the HQ mode and the non-HQ mode when a video is going on YouTube. So feel free to mess around with that if you want to, but in my opinion, you don't really notice too much of a difference. In the normal 4K, if you want to call it that, looks plenty good in my opinion. Now, the last part of this is going to be the IPB versus all-I. Now, back in the day, I say back in the day, but like a year ago, I think a lot of people assumed that all-I just meant it was a higher quality video versus the IPB because the file sizes are so much larger than if you shot an IPB. But the more people have kind of tested things and tried things out, and I've done some tests myself, there's no quality difference between all-I versus IPB. It's basically how the video files in this camera are compressed. So all-I or the all-intra is supposed to be easier for your computer to handle and to edit the footage. So the files that come out of this camera are basically just less compressed. So it's easier for your computer to handle. IPB, the files are more compressed. So it's a little bit harder for your computer to process that footage. Now, to get a little bit more technical here for a second, on the Canon R5, the files coming out of this are in an H.265 codec or format. What that means is basically it's very hard for any computer to handle the files out of this camera right now. So more than likely, unless you have one of the new M1 computers coming out from Apple, you're gonna have to make proxies if you're trying to edit this footage out of this camera, which is a little bit of a process in its own. Let me know if you guys want a video on that topic and I can show you guys how I make proxies. But what I'm trying to say is, even though all-I is supposed to be easier for your computer to handle and to process the footage and edit, your computer more than likely isn't gonna be able to process the all-I footage either. So I always shoot IPB because, as you guys can see over here, the total recording time on a card in here that's 128 gigs, I get 1 hour and 34 minutes and 46 seconds on IPB. And if I switch it over to all-I, I only get 34 minutes and 12 seconds. So IPB, it's a smaller file size and it still looks just as good. So that's what I would suggest. Now, moving on to the next thing, the audio recording level. Now, most of the time, if I'm ever recording audio on this camera, I have like an external microphone, like a Rode Video Micro or Rode Video Mic Pro Plus. And you can go into the settings and change this to auto if you want, but I don't really like to have my audio on auto. I like to just have it on manual, which is what it's on right now. And then I just have it bumped a couple levels lower than the middle. You can tell that little orange arrow there. I like to just have it on manual because that way it's not going to change mid-sentence or while I'm moving around, because sometimes it can do that on auto. The next one is just the volume. So this is just the playback volume if you had headphones plugged in, or if you're listening to the tiny little speaker in this camera if you're playing back footage. This isn't going to affect what's actually recorded at all, so it doesn't really matter too much. I usually just have that cranked up. The next one is the movie digital image stabilization. Now, before the R5, like if you had the Canon EOS R, that camera did not have IBIS. So image stabilization was not an option unless you used the digital image stabilization that Canon offers in these cameras. So as you can see here, if I switch it over to on, it crops in the image a little bit and it basically tries to take out digitally some of that natural camera shake, that hand motion if you were hand holding the camera, which can be really nice, but sometimes it can look a little wonky, especially if you're doing like a big camera move or things like that. If you bump it over one more time, it goes to enhanced. As you can tell, it just crops it in even more, which again, it can get a little bit more wonky even quicker. So just be careful with that. But every now and then I'll have it on, but most of the time I have it off because the R5 does have IBIS now, which is really nice. And sometimes you can have it on as well as the IBIS in the camera and get some pretty smooth looking footage. But sometimes, like I said, you can get some of that warping or some of that wonky looking footage. Now, I will say I do want to touch on one thing with the IBIS in the R5, because as of right now, Canon does not allow you to turn it off whenever you want. The only way to turn it off is if you have a lens on the camera like I do right now, which is the Canon 15-35, which is an image stabilized lens. If I turn off the IS on the lens itself, it then turns off IBIS in the camera. Now you might wonder, why would you want to do that? Because some people have talked about this IBIS wobble that's in the R5. If you're shooting it at a really wide angle, like 16 millimeters, and you're doing some handheld stuff, you kind of can see the sensor wobble a little bit because it's not meant for really wide angles like that. So sometimes I'm vlogging with this camera, I have to turn off the IBIS if I don't want that wobble. So that might sound a little confusing, but I just wanted to touch on that real quick if you are curious how you can turn off the IBIS in the camera, and hopefully Canon at some point allows us to turn it off in the settings as well. The next one down the line here is just you're selecting the card that it's recording to. I just have one card in there right now, but it is nice if you want to switch back and forth real quick. And then the last one here that we're going to talk about is the white balance. I'm always filming in my office here, so I'm going to have it on daylight just because I always am using window light or my Aperture 120D, which is already set to daylight. So that just kind of fits my workflow. Some people shoot on auto white balance if you're moving around a bunch, but I don't really like to have to color correct a bunch of different things. So obviously you can use any of these, but I usually just use daylight, or if I'm shooting something specific or a different location, I'll kind of just dial it in on Kelvin. But for the most part, it just kind of lives on daylight for me. So that's pretty much it for that section. There are a couple things I do want to touch on in the menu here. So let's hop in here real quick. Let's move over a couple and let's talk about the Canon log settings real quick. So Canon log, I love Canon log. I film everything in Canon log. There are rumors that they're going to come out with a firmware update for this camera to offer C-Log 3, which is what are in some of the higher cinema Canon cameras out there, which would be awesome. So if they do, maybe I'll make another video based on that. But as of right now, C-Log, Canon log is what this camera offers. And if you don't know what log is, basically log footage is just a certain picture profile that gives a very, very flat image. It looks extremely desaturated, gray, neutral. And the reason why you would record in that is it gives you more dynamic range. So you get more details in your shadows, you get more details in your highlights. So whenever it comes time to edit that footage in color grade, you just get a lot more detail and a lot better looking image. And what you can actually do once you get familiar with shooting in C-Log, which is what I've done, is I've created my own LUT and just kind of like save my own preset, if you will, for my video footage. And if you guys are interested in picking up my exact LUT that I use on all my YouTube videos when I'm recording in C-Log, I will link it down below. It is called the Jayhawk LUT. I've kind of dialed in my look that I enjoy. So I record in C-Log, I just throw that LUT on an adjustment layer above my footage, and it's honestly just good to go. It looks great, and I just love how it looks. Now, the next item here is the view assist. So basically all that's doing is whenever you're recording in C-Log on this camera, instead of looking at the back of the screen at that grayed out neutral, having the view assist on basically just puts on a temporary LUT whenever you're recording with this camera, so you aren't actually recording seeing this neutral grayed out footage. It's a lot easier to expose to. You can see what it's going to kind of naturally look like, and then it actually has a recorded footage without that, so it's just the normal C-Log, but it just kind of helps you recording. Moving on to the next one, the color matrix. I just have this to the EOS original. I haven't really noticed too much of a difference between these two, so I just keep it on that. And then for me, the characteristics, I just have it on 0 across the board. Now, one more thing I want to touch on over here is if you go to shooting info display, sometimes I like to have the actual grid on. I like the 3x3, so whenever you're recording, you see the grid on there. It just kind of helps you with the rule of thirds and make sure you get a good looking frame. So sometimes I will have that on. Now, if we move over here to the manual focus peaking settings, let's click on that. And this camera does something that's really nice. It shows you peaking whenever you're shooting in manual focus. I'll show you what it looks like here in a second, but I have the level set to high in the color red. Let me show you what that looks like. So if I switch this lens over to manual focus, as you can see, it has that little box in the middle, and then whatever is in focus switches to red, and it will show you what is actually peaking, which is what's in focus. So super helpful if you're ever shooting in manual focus or you're shooting with a manual lens. It's just really nice to know that you're hitting that focus. So it has a little box there with those 2 arrows that kind of help you out, and then also the peaking. So super nice. And that little square with the 2 arrows is the focus guide. So if you enjoy that, you can keep that on. Now, if we move over here, the movie servo autofocus track sensitivity, you can mess around with this a bit. This is basically just how snappy the autofocus is whenever you're recording. I think if it's too high, it looks a little unnatural. And if it's too slow, likewise, it looks unnatural. So I have it just bumped to +1, and that's what looks good to me. Now, the last thing I want to show you guys in here is what I was talking about before, which is the custom shooting modes. So the C1, C2, C3. Let's go back out here to our just main shooting here, which, by the way, if you ever want to see different settings around here, you just hit info. You can kind of scroll through all these different things. This is what I have it on most of the time, so I can see my audio levels. But let's say this is our mode that I shoot in most of the time, right? So this is my 24 frames per second. This is my vlogging, my talking head. Basically 90% of the time I'm using this camera, I'm gonna be shooting in real time, 24 frames per second. So I have my aperture at 2.8 down here. I have my shutter speed double what my frame rate is, so it's gonna be 1/50, and then my ISO is 400, which is most of the time what my ISO is for this camera. So those are kind of my settings, right? I kind of have everything dialed in, all different settings I went over. I want to save this, so if ever I turn on my camera or I'm shooting something different, I can switch back to this very quickly. So we have our settings we want to save. You go into the menu here, you go to the custom shooting mode, register settings, and then you would just register it to C1, C2, or C3. Now, the way I have it set up is I have my 24 frames per second set up as C1. If I hit the mode button up here on the top of the camera in the middle of that dial, let's go to C2. Now, this is my 60 frames per second. So as you can see, it already moved my shutter speed to 1/125. It bumped my ISO up to 800 because at a higher frame rate and higher shutter speed, I need more light. So a lot of times I'll have to bump my ISO up a little bit from 400. So I just already had it set to do that automatically for me. If we go in here to Q, again, you can tell that I have my autofocus mode. It already changed from the face tracking over to this, and it already changed it to 60 frames per second. So like I was saying, I can just quickly move between 60 frames per second. I can move back to 24 frames per second, and it just does all that work for me. And then custom 3, I have it set up to the 120 frames per second. So again, it bumps my shutter speed up to twice that. It has my ISO still at 800 because again, you need more light when you're shooting a higher frame rate. And then of course you can change the settings more if you need to for any reason. It's really nice and handy to have the different custom buttons so you don't have to go into the settings and change all that stuff every time, especially if you're out kind of running gunning. You can switch between everything real nice and quick. And I think that's pretty much it for the main things for my settings. All right, guys, so those are really all the settings that I use on the Canon R5 whenever I'm shooting video. Now, as time goes on and maybe there's another firmware update or things change with this camera, of course, I'll update you guys and make a part 2 if I need to. But for the most part, those are all the settings that I use whenever I'm shooting video with this camera, and it works great for me and fits my workflow. So I hope you guys could find some value out of this video right here. Let me know in the comments below if you guys have any more questions about this camera or maybe some settings that I didn't cover. Feel free to drop me a comment below, and I seriously try to respond to everybody that I can. But guys, I'm gonna wrap up the video right here. I really hope you did find this video helpful. If you stuck around this far into the video, I really do appreciate you guys. And if you would do me a favor, if you would drop this video a thumbs up, that really does help the channel out. If you're new around here, consider hitting that sub button. I'd really appreciate it. And I will see you guys in the next video very, very soon. Peace.